Hello and welcome to the second in a series of videos on Sitecore MVC. My name is Martina and I'm back for part 2, where we'll be looking in greater detail at view renderings, the Sitecore HTML helper, and how to use custom models. Before we get started, let's remind ourselves of what was covered in part 1. We looked at what Sitecore MVC is, in particular in comparison to plain ASP.NET MVC. We also looked at how to install Sitecore MVC and how to create a Visual Studio project to work with it. Finally, we created a very simple view and controller rendering and assigned them to a placeholder on the page using the page editor. It's worth noting that all the examples in the previous video were done in Sitecore 7 and therefore MVC 3. The examples in this video are going to be done in Sitecore 7.1, which is MVC 4. However, although the version of MVC has changed, Sitecore's implementation has remained largely the same, so all the examples should still work in a slightly older version of Sitecore. Let's look at the agenda for this video. First of all, we're going to be looking in closer detail at view renderings, in particular how to access the component's data source and the rendering parameters. Secondly, we're going to look at how to render content using Sitecore's HTML helper, and also how to pass in parameters such as an image's max height. After that, we're going to create our own custom HTML helper. And finally, we're going to find out how to use our own models instead of Sitecore's rendering model. Let me start off by showing you the sample site we'll be working with, which is going to be all about cars and potentially motorcycles. This is the very simple website that we'll be working with for the duration of this video. We've got a very basic layout with a number of components attached to placeholders, like this content component, which outputs data about the context item, and then this 3-column component, which contains a number of smaller spotlight components. If we look at the layout details of this item, you'll see that we've got our layout definition item there, and a number of component definition items, each of which is associated with a placeholder. Each one of these component definition items is making Sitecore aware of a file on the file system. Let's close all this down and head to Visual Studio, where we have each one of those components and the layout as a file. So we've got our layout here, which has just got a placeholder and a container div. Then we've got our content component, which is outputting the title and text fields from the context item. We've also got our 3-column component, which is doing nothing more than presenting some placeholders. And finally, our very empty spotlight component, which is what we're going to be working with for the first part of this video. Notice that as with the first video, we are working outside the web root, which means that once we have made changes inside this project, we have to go and publish our changes to the actual Sitecore web root. This is not to be confused with a Sitecore publish, it's a deploy. So you're building and copying your files into the site web root that you've specified here. Let's go and have a look at what that spotlight component is actually supposed to look like. There are 2 key requirements for our car spotlight component. It needs to be able to accept a car item as a data source from anywhere in the Sitecore tree and output that car's make, model, a link to read more about it, the date the information was posted, and an image. Secondly, I want to be able to vary the component's background color, which I can do using rendering parameters. Finally, as a bonus, I'm going to show you how to improve the page editor experience, even though these features are not Sitecore MVC specific. We're back in Visual Studio, and I've removed a number of things from our spotlight component so that we're starting completely from scratch. The spotlight component is a view rendering, which means that I don't have to worry about creating a controller, because Sitecore is going to provide me with this model called the Sitecore RenderingModel. And the rendering model contains not only information about the particular rendering, but also about the context that we're viewing this component in. For example, we can do model.page item, and that's going to give us the actual context item that we're looking at. So let's output the name. of our page item, which should be home. And as you probably saw, page item name, we also have item in there. And this is actually going to be a data source. And the other way you can access the data source is to do model.rendering.item, which might be a little bit more intuitive because you're saying this is the renderings item, the data source for that rendering. And the other thing we can get from model.rendering is the parameters. So model.rendering.parameters, which is a dictionary, and out of that you can retrieve whatever parameter it is you've set up. So I'm going to set one up shortly called color. Now, before I deploy that, I'm just going to go in and actually create the color parameter, otherwise it's going to complain. So let's go into the component, add color, and I'll remove all of these so that it doesn't complain that it can't find the parameter, and save. And let's go back to Visual Studio and deploy the changes we made using this little Publish Web button. That'll build and copy all of our files. And if we go back and refresh, oh, my mistake. It should be name over here. Deploy again and refresh. There we go. So we can see that the page item name is home, which we would expect, because if we look at the navigation bar, we're actually on the home item. However, it's telling us that the item name is Mazda MX-5, and that's because I've already picked a data source for this spotlight. If we click on the Set Associated Content button, you can see that the data source that I've chosen is an item in the Sitecore tree called Mazda MX-5. So it's retrieving all of its information from that item. And you'll also notice that the parameter that we're outputting, called color, is coming from here. So I can change that to something else. I can change that to blue. And it's going to change what the parameter is outputting. These are all concepts that exist in Sitecore web forms as well, although the way in which you retrieve the item's data source and parameters is slightly different. Before we actually go and do something with all this information, I first want to show you how you can improve the page editor experience. In order to set the data source of this component, I clicked on the Set Associated Content button. And when I did that, you'll notice that it opened up the entire Sitecore tree. So I could go and click on Silverstone, which is obviously not a car. Now, in this particular example, that's going to work absolutely fine because all we're doing is outputting the item name. But if we were looking for a particular field that the Silverstone item didn't have, you might run into problems. Either data wouldn't display or you'd get some kind of error. So what you can do is on the component definition item, you can set up some restrictions. Now I'm going to do that via the page editor. If you click on More, Page Editor Options, let's save. It should give you a pop-up. And this refers to the actual component definition item, not this particular instance, but every single one. And I've got an option in here that says data source location and data source template. And what that means is that I can say, only allow me to choose items from underneath the home item, for example, because that's where the cars are going to live. There we go. So I'm going to expand that and I'm going to select home and click enter or insert. And I only want to be able to choose cars, so no racetracks and no racing championships. So I'm going to go and choose the car template and click insert item on that and then OK. Now, if I go and click set associated content, you'll see that not only am I restricted by location, but I can only choose cars as my data source. Now, as I said, this is not specific to Sitecore MVC, but it's useful to know if you need to support the page editor. Now that we actually know how to retrieve a component's data source and its rendering parameters, let's go and make that spotlight look the way it's supposed to. Let's start by outputting something simple. The make and model of each car item is just a single line text field, so that should be quite easy to output. First, going to start by creating a paragraph inside my spotlight with make. And to output a field, we use the Sitecore HTML helper. Now, we used this briefly in part 1. It's just field, and then it's going to prompt me to put in a field name, which is going to be make. But rather than leaving it like this, which would try and find the make field on the context item, which doesn't have one, we're going to put in an item as well, which is going to be the data source item. And as we just learned, that's model.item or model.rendering.item. Let's do the same for the car model. There. And before we can see that, we're going to have to do a deploy. Let's go and look at our car. Refresh. This component here should change. There we go. It's now outputting the make and model of its data source, and we can prove that by changing the data source to something else. I'm going to change it to the Lancia. And it updated it. Just clean this up a little bit. There we go. Let's save that. So it's now getting its information from the actual data source rather than the context item, which is home. Things get a little bit more interesting when you're outputting an image, link, or date. So let's go and do all 3 of those. There is an image field called image on each of these cars. And we want the image from the data source item. Now, the last thing it asks us for is a list of parameters. And what this means is in web forms, you're going to be used to having something like an SC date, SC image, SC link, where some of the attributes on that tag is going to be things like max width or max height. Now, obviously, because we're using .field for every single field type, we need to pass those field parameters in a different way. Now, those of you who use the field renderer a lot will probably recognize this, but just like in regular MVC, we do new here, and max width I'm going to set to 300, max height I'm going to set to 400. There are other properties as well you can add to an image, like H space, and make that 10, and V space, which is horizontal and vertical spacing. But I'm also going to add something that's not image specific, like a class, for example, or just a regular CSS class. Now, the same kind of thing applies to a link. We are again using the Sitecore field helper. There is a website field, which is a general link. But into this, we could pass something like text. So if you want to use the same text everywhere, which isn't advised, you can pass in text like that, and Sitecore will know that because you specify text, rather than using the link description in the anchor's text, it's going to put in this. Finally, let's look at date. And I'm just going to use the created date, which is a standard field. And here you can pass in something like the format. Now, on a multi-language site, you probably wouldn't want to do this because different cultures are going to have different date formats. But I'm just doing it to demonstrate. Let's deploy that and have a look what happens. Okay, so as you can see, the image has got some vertical and horizontal spacing around it. And if we look at it in here, you'll see that the max width and max height got appended to the end of the image URL. the H space and V space got added as attributes, as did the class. So the properties or attributes, that Sitecore knows what to do with, it'll process. Otherwise, MVC will deal with it as it normally would. So you can use data attributes, for example, and Sitecore is not going to interfere with them. You can also see on the general link field and on the date field that our field parameters took effect there. If we switch to editing, you can see that although this website link has a description over here, it doesn't matter what we write. Because we've overridden the text in code, it's always going to be that. Now, one final thing to show you about the field helper is how to disable web editing, which is useful for things like meta information in the head. Now, this can be used on any field. Disable web editing equals true, which is an anonymous type. I spelled that wrong. Now, this should prevent us from being able to edit this image field despite using the Sitecore field helper. So let's refresh. That's actually supposed to be web edit, not editing. Let's change that. And deploy. And refresh again. And we are now unable to edit that image. So again, that's very useful for things like the page title or meta description, for example. Let's just prove that everything works. Let's go and add in another component of exactly the same type. We want a spotlight. Because we set the data source template and the data source location, we're restricted in what we can choose. So I'm going to pick the Mazda again. And as you can see, it's outputting the information from that data source. Let's summarize what we've seen so far. We created a component called a spotlight, which used the Sitecore rendering model. That rendering model gives us access to the page item, which is the context item we're currently viewing. It gives us access to the data source item in two different ways, and the rendering's parameters. We also looked at how to use the Sitecore field helper to output data from that data source item, and how to pass in field parameters. This leads us on to our next topic, which is how to create a custom Sitecore HTML helper. You may want to extend the Sitecore HTML helper. For example, you might want to create a more specialized image field rather than using .field for everything. Let's do that as an example. I've created a Sitecore field helper class here in my own namespace, and I'm going to create a public static HTML string, which I'm going to call ImageField. And into that, I'm going to pass a Sitecore helper. And then, of course, all fields are going to need a field name, which is a string. They're going to need an item. But I also want to pass in max height and max width and a boolean for disable web editing, which I'm going to set to false by default. Inside that method, I'm going to return the helper field, and that of course takes a field name. So this is the standard one we're using now. And it takes an item, and then it wants me to pass in everything else as parameters. Now the cool thing is that I don't have to do mh equals mh for max height. I just pass in mh and max width and disable web edit. Let's compile that. Go into our spotlight, add a using to the top here. And you will find that our Sitecore HTML helper now has an additional field, or additional extension method rather, called ImageField. I can pass in exactly the same parameters as I did on that for the one at the very top here. Image, item, let's pass in 200, 300, and true. So we should get the image with this max width and max height set, and we should not be able to edit it. Let's deploy that. Now we've got an image here at the very bottom. Let's preview it. So it's clearly uploading the image. It's got the max height and the max width in there. And let's double check if we can edit it. No, we cannot. So the disable web editing worked. You can build yourself a library of various extension methods to the Sitecore helper. And it may be that you don't use the generic field helper at all. Up until this point, we've only used Sitecore's rendering model. However, that may not be appropriate for your particular project. In this section, I'm going to show you how to create custom models in the context of a Sitecore project. Before we start, it's important to note that there is really no right or wrong way to do this. It depends on your priorities, what your team are like, or if you have any preferred patterns. Ultimately, the goal is identical. You want to get data out of Sitecore and into a model that you can work with. When I say priorities, I'm really talking about these three things. Do you want page editor support, both editing and designing? Do you need testability? And by that, I largely mean unit tests. Or is there a standard pattern that you prefer using? All of these factors will determine how you choose to populate your model. There are probably as many methods as there are developers. So I'm going to show you two main ways and subcategories within each. Option 1 is to use Sitecore's MVC pipelines to give you a model. What happens here is that Sitecore assembles the model for you. You don't need a controller, so you can use a view rendering. And you can always rewrite the pipeline if the way it assembles your model is not to your liking. The second category is a bit broader. I've just called it do it yourself. What I mean here is you can populate your model in your controller, which will require you to use a controller rendering. Within that controller, you can either initialize the model in much the same way as the Sitecore MVC pipelines do. You can use a repository or factory to return a populated model. Or you could use third-party plumbing like Glass, for example, or really anything else you can think of that solves your problem. Again, there are no set rules on this, and recommended practice is as much an MVC question as it is a Sitecore question. Let's start with option 1. How do I get Sitecore's MVC pipelines to populate my model for me? Well, the first thing you have to do is to create your custom model. I'm going to create a model called car because we have a lot of cars in our content tree. And this is just to start with a regular class. Once I've created my model, I've got two options. I can either inherit from the standard rendering model, in which case everything that the rendering model is able to do, my car will also be able to do. However, instead of doing that, I'm going to implement the RenderingModel interface instead. And this is just so that I can show you what the rendering model actually does behind the scenes. Now, the rendering model interface is only going to ask me to create an initialize method. And it's this initialize method that the MVC pipelines call, pass in the context rendering, and the model's built up from that. Now, if you recall, the standard rendering model has three properties that we found very useful. One of them was the actual rendering. The other was an item called just item, which represents the data source. And the third was the page item, which represents the context item we're currently looking at. Now, when the pipeline calls this initialize method on the model, it sets all of these properties. So let's do that. This is not exactly the same way that it does it, but more or less. Let's set the rendering to rendering. And let's set the item, which is the data source, to the renderings item. And the page item actually comes from something called the page context. You might recognize this from web forms where you use sitecore.context.item. And now this car does pretty much everything that the rendering model does. However, in addition to all of these properties, I also want to add properties that are actually about the car. For example, I want to add a string for the make of the car, and I want to add a string for the model of car. And inside the initialize, I want to set those as well. So the make of my car is going to be a field on the item, which is the data source, called make. The same applies to model. And save that. Now that we've created our model, we need to make Sitecore aware that it exists. And to do that, we go into the Sitecore tree. Under Layout, there is a Models folder. And if you right-click on that and go to Add, you'll see that there is a model template that you can use. I'm going to call that car. Now the only field you need to fill in here is the model type. So that's this. Let's copy that and paste it in. And that's step 2. Register your model with Sitecore. The final step is to tell the view rendering that it should use this model. Now we're going to create a brand new view in order to do this. So let's go into the Solution Explorer, right-click, and add a new item. And then in the Sitecore menu, we're going to select MVC and create a new partial page. I'm going to call that Featured Car. Because I've connected my project with my Sitecore implementation, it's going to ask me where do you want to create the corresponding item, and I want to create it in the MBC tutorial subfolder. Now, as you can see, by default, it's expecting a rendering model, but I'm going to change that to car. Okay. And the final piece of the puzzle is on the presentation definition item, which is here. I'm going to tell it to expect car. So I'm going to double click on featured car. There is a model field here, which expects a GUID. If I right click on an item in Sitecore Rocks and go to clipboard, I can copy the ID. Copy and paste and save that. Let's go into our featured car view rendering and actually output something. So we're going to output the model, which is just going to be model.model, confusingly. And then I want to output the make, which is going to be model.make. Now let's build and publish that. Actually, before we add it to the page, let's make it a bit nicer by adding a highlight. There we go. Deploy that. Okay, and there is our featured car component. Now let's choose a data source to prove that this actually works. It needs to be a car. And there you go. We are now using our own custom model with a view rendering. However, you will notice that if I enable editing, I can't actually edit any of these, and that's because I'm not going via the field renderer. So let's fix that. Back to our car class. So instead of getting the raw value, we're going to use field renderer.render, pass in the item, and pass in the field name. Let's just put in a using. Fix this. And let's do the same for model. Just gonna copy and paste that in. Now, something funny is going to happen when I deploy this and try to view that page again in the page editor. And as you can see, the page editor HTML is now encoded, which we don't want because this is obviously completely unusable. So the way to fix that is you could either do html.raw in your view rendering over here. However, that's not particularly good practice. So what we're going to do is, instead of returning a string, we're going to return an HTML string here. And that means we need to make a small change down here. New HTML string. Save and deploy that. And refresh. And now we've got page editor support with our custom model. Let's recap what we've just done. We created a class called car and implemented RenderingModel. Inside the initialize method, we built up that model's properties. We then registered the model in Sitecore by creating an item that referenced the car class. Finally, we assigned that model item to a particular rendering. By doing that, we ensure that when that rendering is added to a page, Sitecore knows which model to initialize. What are the pros and cons of this approach? Well, we don't need to create a controller, so we can continue using view renderings with our custom model. However, you now have data fetching logic inside the model. My example is even worse because I've used fieldRenderer.render directly inside the initialize method, which means you now have a dependency on Sitecore. You could, of course, decouple the model from Sitecore by passing off the data population responsibility to some kind of repository or a method elsewhere. Finally, some MVC developers might balk at the idea of an initialize method, which isn't commonly seen in MVC. However, you could always rewrite the pipeline and get rid of it. In summary, there's loads of things you can do with dependency injection and other cleverness to ensure that you have a model that's both testable and page editor friendly. The key point to take away from this is that Sitecore assembles your model for you. You aren't using a controller. In option 1, Sitecore is responsible for instantiating our model class. It does mean you don't have to create a controller, but as this is MVC, sometimes we're going to want one. Our second category has as many options as you could conceivably think of. I'm going to show you 2. First of all, I'm going to do pretty much exactly what the MBC pipeline does, but within the context of a controller. As a second option, I'm going to create a repository that's going to populate my model for me. As ever, you are very welcome to roll your own solution. It depends very much on what your preferences and your particular issues are. For this new example, I'm going to focus on racing circuits rather than cars. And the first thing I'm going to do is to create a model for a race circuit. And as we know, that is just a class. And I'm going to inherit from a rendering model. I know that every circuit has a name, and I'm actually just going to return field renderer.render here, get the item and also the name, and I'm going to do the same for the text associated with it. There we go. Copy that. And there is a rich text field. And because I'm inheriting straight from RenderingModel, the initialize is going to take care of setting the item and the page item and the rendering as properties. I don't have to do that myself. However, because we are not going to be using the Sitecore MVC pipeline, something needs to actually call the initialize method on the rendering model. And this is what I'm going to do inside a controller. So once I've created my model, and notice I have not registered it with Sitecore, I'm going to create my controller. And I'm going to call it my circuit controller. There we go. And inside my circuit controller, which is just a plain MVC controller, I'm going to create an action result called featured. Now we all know that the action result needs to return something. So I'm going to return a regular view called featured. There we go. I'm going to get rid of all of this and give it the model circuit. And inside here, I'm going to just create a div to make it look a bit nicer. And I'll put the name of the circuit. And also the text associated with it. Notice I haven't done anything even remotely Sitecore-y, but that's coming. So I'm going to go back into my controller. And we said that we wanted to use this circuit model. I'm going to create a new instance of my circuit. There we go. And because this is inheriting from RenderingModel, I am just going to call initialize, and that's expecting a rendering. And you can get the rendering from the rendering context. And we go to current rendering. Once we've done that, we can pass the circuit in here. Let's build. Okay, so really none of that apart from initialize has anything to do with Sitecore. The only thing that Sitecore needs to know is about the circuit controller. So let's go into renderings and create a new MVC rendering. And this is going to have to be a controller rendering. There. And I'll call it featured circuit. Okay. And the controller is just circuit. And the action is featured. Let's deploy those files and try to add it to the page using the page editor. Let's refresh. Okay, let's go to a placeholder and add our rendering, which is in here. There's our featured circuit. I'm going to open the properties dialog so I can give it a data source. There we go. Browse for the data source, which has to be a circuit, and I'm going to choose Alton Park. Click OK. And as you can see, the name and text are now coming from the Alton Park item. Now, the only difference between what we just did and what Sitecore itself does is that it was more DIY. I actually did all the work inside the controller. This is more or less what happens inside Sitecore's MVC pipeline anyway. To prove that to you, we can actually go and have a look inside the MVC pipeline. So the list of MVC pipelines is in here. If we have a look at app config in the include, there is an MVC specific configuration file in there. Let's open that. And we'll locate, here we go. So we've got this whole section called get model, and inside there we've got this processor called initialize model. And if we go into .peak and have a little look, let's find it. Initialize model. You can see that Sitecore gets a bunch of arguments, goes to initialize, and eventually you see you've got the rendering model.initialize, and it passes in the context rendering, which is exactly what we've just done in our own solution here. Now, this is still not very nice. Inside our circuit, even if we were to abstract it, we've still got the model being aware of where it's getting its data from. And in my particular example, again, we've got a dependency on Sitecore. And we're having to use this initialize method, which a lot of people don't really like. Now, a simple way to avoid all of that would just be to hand off the model populating responsibilities to a repository. And that brings us to our second example. To do this example, I'm going to use drivers so that they're all separate. The first thing I'm going to do is to create a driver model. But I'm going to leave this one completely unaware of where it's getting its data from. So we're just going to create a name and some text. Secondly, we're going to create another controller for the drivers. And inside there, we're also going to have a featured. And of course, this needs to be a normal controller. We want that to return a view. Let's create it. And we want that to be a driver. And let's just output some information, like the name. And some text. But instead of doing all the work inside the controller or even in the model, we're going to do it in a repository. Let's create a repository. Already got one called repositories. Yes, I do. Let's call this the driver repository. And it's going to have one method called getDriver. And it's inside this repository that I'm going to populate my driver model. So let's create a new driver. And what do we need in order to be able to get information for this driver? Well, we're assuming that we want to get whatever the context driver is. So we need the rendering context, because we need the current rendering. And from that rendering, we can work out what the data source is. This is just the renderings item. And that's all we need in order to be able to populate the driver, because from that data source we can say, well, I know that the driver name is whatever is on the data source called name. And I'm using the field renderer so that we have page editor support. Same goes for the text. Dot render. And of course, these are HTML strings, so I'll need to do this. And then return the completed driver. Okay, let's go and use this driver repository inside our controller. All I'm going to do is create a new instance. And get my driver. and return that driver to my view. Let's compile and deploy. Okay. Finally, we need to create a rendering that actually knows about this driver controller. So let's create one of those. Again, it's a controller rendering. There it is. I'm going to call this featured driver. And I'm telling it that you want the driver controller and the featured action. Oh, I didn't need to do that. Let's go to the browser. We can get rid of this now. Insert new rendering. And let's pick the featured driver rendering and open properties immediately so we can pick a data source. There it is. And let's choose Kimmy and click OK. And as you can see, the name's being output and the text is being output, but it's all been assembled in a repository. Now, in a real world scenario, I wouldn't use this hard-coded driver repository here. I would use an IOC container and inject that into the constructor of the controller, which means I can swap out this Sitecore dependent repository for a test repository, for example. We could extend this example a little bit and actually create a view model. So again, that's not really anything to do with Sitecore, but you might want to get your information about your context item, which is not part of the actual driver model, or your parameters and put them into a view model instead. So let's go and do that. I'm going to create here a driver view model, which is going to have a driver and also a background color. And finally, in case we need it, I'm going to get the context item. Again, we could go into our repository that we created earlier, and we could say, not only do I want to get the driver, but I want to be able to get the driver view model from here. Get driver view model. Create a new view model. The background could be color, for example. So we would do get the rendering context first of all. And from that rendering, we would be able to go, well, I want your parameters and I want the one called background, which could be a color. I also want to get the context item, so the item you're currently looking at. And to do that, I'm going to do page context current item. And I could also say, actually, I'm going to pass you the driver when I create this. And that means that your driver is going to be whatever I just passed in. So if we extend our controller a bit, we could do repository.get driver view model, pass in the driver, give a view model to the view, modify the view slightly so that it accepts it. There. And then we can output the context item name, which might be probably going to be home. And we can output the background color parameter. There. And here we're going to need to modify to say driver. Okay. Let's just make sure that there is a background for it to output. So in our featured driver, I'm going to edit properties, add a background, Make it white and save. And let's build all of this. I forgot to return my view model. Okay, and let's look and see what happened. And there you go. So we've still got the name and the text, but we've also got the home context item name and the background color parameter coming from the view model. So really, in this instance, the only thing that Sitecore is actually responsible for is presenting you with whatever controller and action you specified, and everything to do with Sitecore happens in this single place inside the driver repository, which ultimately does a lot of similar things to what you did in your controller for the circuit. So we've just abstracted it away to another layer. And if you add dependency injection on top of this, you have something that's starting to look a lot more like a traditional MBC project. We looked at two ways that you could instantiate the model yourself. Our first option was to inherit from the rendering model and just use the initialize method. That method takes the rendering, the context rendering, as a parameter, and we then use that to populate the model's properties. You could of course rewrite the pipeline so that there's no need for an initialize method anymore, and individual model properties could call a service to get the data rather than the field renderer being hard-coded inside each get. But ultimately, this first option was all about showing you how you could have a self-initializing model. Our second option was to get our model, and we also got our view model, from a repository of some kind. You could potentially also use a factory, so request an instance of an iCar and do all the resolving within a factory class. And you could of course inject your repository so that you could have something for Sitecore and something for testing. That way you are removing your dependency on Sitecore within the controller. Ultimately, it's your decision what you choose to use, and you may come up with a solution that's not listed here, which is absolutely fine, as long as you consider what your project priorities are. Do you need testability? Do you need page editor support? Do you need to use a particular set of MVC patterns? And that brings us to the end of part 2. Before I go, let's summarize what we've covered in this video. First of all, we looked at view renderings and Sitecore's rendering model. In particular, how to extract the data source of that rendering and its rendering parameters. We also looked in greater detail at the Sitecore field helper, in particular how to pass in field parameters, such as the max width and max height for images, or the text for links. Finally, in this first section, we created a couple of custom HTML helpers to allow us to do .ImageField and .linkField rather than using the generic .field helper. In the second part of this video, we discussed options for using your own model. And I say discussed because, as we said, there is no right or wrong way to do this. And it depends entirely on what your priorities are. For example, do you need page editor support? Do you need testability? Or do you need to use a particular MVC pattern? We did, however, go through a few examples. You could either hand over the responsibility for assembling your model to Sitecore's MVC Pipeline. This meant you did not need a controller and you could continue to use view renderings. Our second category of options involved assembling the model ourselves, either in the controller or by passing it off to a repository or a factory of some kind. The key difference here is that you are using controller renderings instead of view renderings. Ultimately, you want to make sure that whatever option you go for supports the Sitecore features that you need to support and fits in with your project architecture. And that's it from me. Thank you for tuning in, and see you in part 3.